Hi, everyone. I'm John Shostak. I'm a professor of Japanese art history in the Department of Art and Art History here at UH Manoa. It's a real pleasure to introduce Dr. Sawako Chang to the CJS community and larger audience. Dr. Takemoto Chang is an experienced curator, researcher, and internationally esteemed expert on Edo period woodblock prints. She earned her MA in art history here in UH Manoa, I'm proud to say, in my own department. And after this, she worked for 10 years at the Honolulu Museum of Art in several roles, including manager of the Japanese Art Imaging Project and assistant curator of Japanese art. She went on to receive her PhD in Japanese art and visual studies at Leiden University, the Netherlands, for a dissertation that examines the emergence of a new type of female image in ukiyo-e woodblock prints designed by Keisai Eisen, a Japanese artist active in the first half of the 19th century. I think it's safe to say that when the topic of bijin-ga, or images of beautiful female subjects, is discussed, a predominantly male viewership is assumed. But as Dr. Takemoto Chang's research explains, there is a different viewer context for these images. To quote Dr. Takemoto Chang herself, her research constructs a critical reevaluation of Eisen's bijin-ga imagery by analyzing the socio-political conditions in which a female commoner class audience emerged. Today, she will discuss this research and her observations on this fascinating representative artist of the late Edo period in a paper entitled Decadent Yet Ideal: Style and Function of Female Images in Prints by Keisai Eisen. Now, before I turn it over to Dr. Takemoto Chang, I will note that if you have questions and you enter them into the Q&A, we're going to be answering them at the very end. She'll speak, and then when her paper is finished, I'll return and I will sort of coordinate the Q&A by reading those questions, all right? We may not get to all of the questions. I'll try to do them in the order that they come, but we may not get to all of them. I hope we're able to answer all of your questions, but in any case, we'll have a lot to learn, I think, from Dr. Takemoto Chang. So Dr. Takemoto Chang, please take it away.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, John, for the nice introduction. I also want to thank to Dr. Gei Satsuma and Tori Tanigawa for the preparation for the talk. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'd like to talk about 19th century bijin-ga, decadent yet ideal. This presentation is a part of my completed dissertation research. My research explores women's social status in the first half of the 19th century through an examination of example of bijin-ga by such artists as Eisen. My discussion aims to demonstrate the aesthetic changes associated with the social transformation, including women's life condition and gender roles in relation to the development of market economy. The emerging female consumer of those bijin-ga desire to emulate them within the context of male expectation. I believe that they partly function to educate women of the time in how they should look and behave in order to be favored and accepted by the male-dominant society. 19th century picture of beautiful women, generally categorized as bijin-ga, have been labeled as decadent or taihaiteki by a number of modern ukiyo-e scholars. This presentation considers why these images appear decadent to the eyes of those modern scholars, as well as how the prints were possibly consumed at the time of their production. As a case study, I will analyze several prints by Keisai Eisen. I will investigate the change of general perception of lower ordinary class sex workers who are frequently depicted in ukiyo-e of that time. As suggested by A.B. Stanley, society began to consider such workers to be morally corrupt, which is reflected in late Edo period bijin-ga. Paradoxically, prostitutes, including geisha, were romanticized and recast as a paragons of womanhood through various media, including bijin-ga and popular fiction, such as ninjobon, books of romance, which were largely targeted at a female audience. Although until recently, 19th century bijin-ga have been largely disregarded or dismissed as decadent, the commoditized but financially independent women they depict seem to have been sought after both by men and women in the lower middle social stratum. So who is Keisai Eisen? First, I'd like to introduce the ukiyo-e artist Eisen. He was active in the first half of the 19th century in the city of Edo. According to Matsuda Misako, of Eisen's 1,265 extant full-color Nishikie design, approximately 70% are images of female beauties. This number indicates that Eisen's specialty was bijin-ga. He was trained in the Kano School of Painting when he was young, associated with the samurai class, and the Eisen was actually from a minor samurai official family. As you see here, Eisen designed some landscape prints based on the Kano Chinese style of landscape painting. He was also known to have collaborated with Utagawa Hiroshige for the production of the print series 49 Station of Kiso Road. Eisen is also known to have worked with Hokusai and his daughter Oe. Hokusai is not technically his master, but some of Eisen's work demonstrate some stylistic influence from Hokusai's works. Eisen also designed many erotic print, shunga. He also produced many book illustration designs, just like other ukiyo-e artists. Thus, as a whole, Eisen is a versatile commercial artist who can depict things in many genres, employed by many publishers. Although he was not listed as one of the golden age ukiyo-e artists by early 20th century, ukiyo-e connoisseurs, including Gonku and Noguchi Yonejiro, a volume of Eisen's extant design can confirm that he was one of the most popular artists of that time. Although Eisen is not one of the most recognized ukiyo-e artists in our contemporary time, unlike Utamaro and Katsushika Hokusai, his bijin-ga has become widely known thanks to modern artists such as Vincent van Gogh, who created them in a new medium in his well-known painting such as this one. This is a portrait of a more upper-class courtesan painted by Van Gogh in 1887, in which he traced the image from a cover page of monthly journal, Paris Illustré Le Japon, published by Charles Giraud, who was also an editor of Art Japon, published by Samuel Bin, a famous French collector and dealer of Japanese art. Samuel Bin was an instrumental figure to introduce ukiyo-e and other Japanese artworks to the West during the late 19th century. The Japanese art movement in Europe is known as Japonism. Selection of this image for the journal by Giraud and the painting by Van Gogh suggests that they were visually attracted by this specific female image designed by Eisen. Ukiyo researchers have pointed out that aesthetic of bijin-ga designed by such ukiyo artists as Eisen changed in the early 19th century. Alan Copley describes 19th century bijin-ga. Their women tended to look more worldly. They became increasingly more elaborate when depicted with brighter coloring. bijin-ga of the mid to late 19th century have often been criticized for lacking the subtlety of 18th century print. The original female image reproduced in the journal cover page is a vertical print of a courtesan, as seen here. It is a rather large work, and the woman's body makes an S-shaped form with black kimono with sweeping dragons and cloud. Her hair has many large hairpins encompassing the head, giving a striking impression of her vivid appearance. Eisen's bijin-ga differs from bijin-ga popular in the previous era, exemplified by Utamaro's bijin-ga. As shown here, which depict decorous women who appears still and calm, posing nicely for viewers. Altogether, Eisen's female image is bold and kinetic. The female figure depicted by Eisen in the early to mid 19th century may lack the subtlety of 18th century print, but they were certainly in great demand by ukiyo-e consumer in his time, judging by the prodigious number of his bijin-ga that has survived. In spite of the apparent success Eisen enjoyed as an artist in his time, modern ukiyo-e scholars of art and literature in the succeeding 20th century have been classifying his bijin-ga as belonging to the Decadent school. Okay. I have this image just for fun. This is a painting, another painting by Van Gogh, and you can see the same female image in the back of this Pele right here. It's the same image of Eisen, and you have another bijin-ga depicted here. And you also see the landscape probably by Hiroshige, 53 Station of Tokaido, and Mount Fuji and Cherry Blossom and Morning Glory. So it is known that Van Gogh's studio was decorated with many ukiyo-e prints. So what are decadent print? Ernest Fenollosa, an American historian of Japanese art and a professor at the Tokyo Imperial University, stated in his 1896 book, The Master of Ukiyo-e, that the decline of ukiyo-e began in 1807. He called Keisai Eisen a follower of the most decaying style. Others who considered Eisen's bijin-ga taihaiteki or decadent include Nagai Kafu and Ozaki Kyuya. In his 1925 book, Ukiyo-e to Taihai-ha, Ukiyo-e and its Decadent School, Ozaki claims that Utamaro's bijin-ga demonstrate the beauty of sacred mother-like figure, bofunobi, while Eisen's expressed the eroticism of prostitute, shofunobi. In fact, this was not a criticism. In his view, Eisen's bijin-ga freely expressed freedom and individuality. Late Edo period bijin-ga were eventually praised by many artists who were against the academicism of the government-sponsored exhibition during the Taisho democracy movement. According to Ozaki, erotic equals decadent. It should be noted that Ozaki's perception of the late Edo period bijin-ga was based on an approach to sex largely influenced by newly introduced Western mores, which valued the importance of family and women's chastity. This approach entered Japan as a part of modernity or becoming civilized, and is very different from approaches to sex in the Edo period. Thus, we must be cautious about judging Edo era production by modern standards. In addition, earlier modern historians of Japanese art, including Fenollosa, tried to build a canon of Japanese art history based on Western value in order to create acceptance of Japan by Euro-American powers. Reconsidering how Eisen's bijin-ga were perceived by audiences at the time of production might lead us to a different reading of those works. There is definitely a change in mood in Eisen's bijin-ga. In other words, the elegant atmosphere in bijin-ga of previous eras was replaced by a new aesthetic. What might this change indicate? As mentioned, ukiyo-e artists in the first half of the 19th century began to portray the increasing number of lower class prostitutes. For instance, Eisen designed print series Bijin Tokaido, featuring a woman at each station of the Tokaido Road. It is hard to understand the concept of the series at initial glance. For example, Oiso Station depicts a woman who is stripped to the waist, washing herself, her body in an unnatural but sensuous pose, looking directly at the viewer, in what could be considered a quite seductive manner. During the mid to late 18th century, the sex trade expanded into the provinces, partly as a consequence of the development of the agricultural industry, as farmers made money from manufacturing and producing finished or semi-finished items to sell to distant markets. And even countryside male peasants could afford to visit local brothels. At the same time, because of the emergence of a culture of travel, many inns at post station began to offer sexual services along with food and lodging. Thus, the print series Bijin Tokaido might have functioned to advertise each station and the delight available there. Another series, Birthday with Comic Allusion, depicts a seductive woman and a famous temple or shrine in a Emma-shaped cartouche. Famous temples and shrines were common sightseeing spots, and restaurants, inns, souvenir shops, and so on in temple or shrine towns profited from the tourism. To attract more visitors, prostitutes became often also available in these locations by the early 19th century. Hence, this series is also assumed to have functioned to advertise both the sightseeing and the sexual opportunities available, leading to more revenue. So by the mid-18th century, women who were professionally trained in singing, dancing, and playing musical instruments like the shamisen, that is geisha, became popular in the city of Edo, where they attended private banquets. Many of them were also known to sell sexual services, but the city magistrate decided to turn a blind eye as long as the activities were conducted with both parties' agreement. It was also difficult to investigate such activities, since these women made a spontaneous or sporadic decision to exchange sex for payment. The relative freedom afforded geisha encouraged ordinary townspeople to take advantage of this new entertainment enterprise. Among the increasing number of prostitutes outside the licensed quarter, geisha, especially in Fukagawa area, were the most popular and became paragons of beauty, even though they were in more casual and unlicensed quarters, technically making them of lower status than courtesan of the formal licensed quarters like Yoshiwara. Interestingly, geisha and other lower class sex workers were often depicted by Eisen and his contemporary artists as a new type of tough, independent women. For example, this print entitled Looks Tough or Tegowaso from the City's 12 View of Modern Beauty was designed by Eisen. It depicts a woman shown from the waist up, applying makeup in front of mirror. On upper left side is a hand scroll-shaped cartouche showing a landscape of Fukagawa Hachiman Shrine. So the woman might be a geisha or prostitute who worked in the Fukagawa brothel area. There is no hint of woe emotion in her expression, indicating her toughness. She looks much more powerful than earlier idealized, fragile, and delicate female images depicted by such artists as Harunobu and Utamaro. This woman does not represent someone who is willing to please, welcome, or serve men, despite her likely occupation as an entertainer or sex worker. In early Edo period, prostitutes who were sold to alleviate their family's poverty were considered filial daughters. To put it another way, prostitution had originally only been allowed as a last resort for family under the patriarchal system, and Tokugawa officials were able to play the part of benevolent rulers, maintaining the financial stability of each region and protecting poor townsmen's household. Indentured prostitute in the licensed quarters also had a certain right and protection from the government. This flow of patriarchal logic worked when prostitution was conducted under the indentured system only at the licensed quarter. In the freer geisha system, women could be pure commodities without right. More business-minded townspeople were interested in a prostitution enterprise to make extra money rather than to save disenfranchised family, with some even selling their daughters for profit. Social critic Buyo Inshi decries the collapse of the social order in 1816, writing that the skyrocketing popularity of prostitutes was evidence of a general decline in public morality. To clarify, what the government was concerned about was not moral corruption in terms of sexual puritanism, but rather the motivation for prostitution. In other words, the former image of prostitutes as dutiful daughters who are working to save their family has been replaced by the image of this geisha, dangerous, decadent woman who is tough enough to live as a free agent, as seen in the bijin-ga, looks tough. It should be noted here that the motivation for a majority of women who worked as a freelance prostitute, including geisha, was often still for saving impoverished families. As Stanley demonstrates, according to the gender role assigned by patriarchal government system, women were not to be financially or socially independent. Accordingly, the government began to see the increasing number of financial independent females as a threat. In addition, as more men spent money at the brothel in regional areas, sex workers began to be regarded as selfish whore who brought familial and marital discord. Instead of blaming the men who frequented them, society instead problematized the women themselves. Hence, the former view of prostitutes as dutiful daughters shifted and they gradually became stigmatized. Yet, even as prostitute was seen as a threat by male social authority in the patriarchal society, some financially independent geisha were admired for their refined fashion, manner, and behaviors. Although they might have been regarded as dangerous or decadent, geisha became the embodiment of ideal femininity for the ordinary class. Even for some upper middle class young women, the musical and dance skill that geisha were commonly equipped with were crucial for being employed in indentured service by a well-to-do family. The experience of working in such established household generally led to a good marriage, which was considered the pinnacle of success for a woman's life. During the late Edo period, as described in the popular literature, attractive women, including geisha, developed a new aesthetic variously called ada, iki, isami hada, or denpo hada. Although each term has a slightly different nuance, they all refer to someone sensuous, dashing, brave, and tough. Eisen's print looks tough may reflect the cool toughness of the independent geisha. These new characteristics of women were admired and praised by a larger audience. Popular lower class sex workers were further romanticized and commercialized by the publishing industry. Eisen's print series, Contests Between Contemporary, include 8 extant bijin-ga, the majority of them depicting geisha or lower class sex workers. One of these is women in front of mirror. Since it has no description, it is difficult to identify exactly what kind of woman she is. Her hairstyle is much simpler than that of an oiran. She wears a loose, simple kimono. One of her arms is tucked inside her undergarment, a conventional pose for a prostitute in ukiyo-e. The hair on the side of her face and neck is disheveled, creating a naturalistic and sensuous impression. She wears rather heavy makeup with white powder and a greenish color on her lower lip, which was trendy at the time. Altogether, she looks self-indulgent and sensuous. All these details suggest that she's not a high-ranking courtesan, but a lower-class sex worker such as geisha. Interestingly, this series depicts only one Yoshiwara high-ranked courtesan. The composition of each print is the same, a bust portrait format with a Chinese poem which praised the beauty or fame of the women depicted. Since the majority of the women depicted in this series are geisha or lower-class prostitute, and as the title indicates, it is a competition of beautiful women. The suggestion is that these lower-class sex workers are equal to the high-ranking courtesan of Yoshiwara, despite their low rank. Even without Oiran's gorgeous kimono and elaborate hairstyle with its many hairpins, one might feel that all these women are equally beautiful. Here, we might be able to see the intention of sponsors, publishers, and artists to idealize sex workers for their mutual profit. In this way, the sex industry can maximize its profit from a wide range of clients. Popular books such as Ninjobon also further idealize sex workers like geisha. Ninjobon depict entanglement of love relationship and human feelings with the urbane Edo downtown atmosphere. One of the most popular Ninjobon is Shunshoku Umegoyomi, or Plum Calendar, by Tamenaga Shunsu. This story depicts a love triangle featuring a female protagonist, the geisha Yonehachi, her rival Ocho, and the male protagonist, Tanjiro. In this story, Yonehachi is depicted as the embodiment of ideal femininity. Her strength is the faithfulness of her love for Tanjiro, as well as her generous acceptance of his other lovers. With her stylish appearance depicted in the book illustration and described in the story, the geisha is idealized as the most sought after women in terms of both appearance and inner character. Indeed, Ninjōgon often describes the detail of women's appearance, including clothing and makeup. For example, Shunshoku Umeboyomi, Volume 3 state, pink color of skin right after bath, age around 16 or 17, astonishingly beautiful. Another part, Volume 9 said, disheveled hair of the Shimada style after bath. Bare skin is straightforwardly so pretty, and the eye area is lightly pink. Akai Tatsuro pointed out that these women depicted are reminiscent of Eisen's bijin-ga. Eisen was actually a member of Shunsui's literary circle and the book illustrator for Shunsui's Ninjōgon, as shown here. As we have seen, women in front of mirror depict women wearing pink eye makeup. See here, the little bit pink on the eye area. There are other prints that shows the same makeup. This lady also has a pink makeup, and there's another print showing that makeup. So as mentioned in Nihon Kijin-den by Hanagasa Bunkyo, every plot or ideas in Shunsui's Ninjōgon stories originally came from Eisen. Conversely, Eisen's bijin-ga may well reflect the atmosphere of character in Shunsui's Ninjōgon. Finally, it should be noted that Ninjōgon were known to target a female audience. As Shunsui made clear in the preface of Shunshoku Umeboyomi, the frequent appearance of advertisement of face powder, senjoko, further point to a female audience. Eisen's bijin-ga also often depict women holding a senjoko face powder. So you see the senjoko face powder right here. In addition, in the temple reform, Shunsui was arrested for his ninjōgon that were thought to be harmful to women's morale. This also proves the existence of female audience for that genre. Accordingly, those publications, including ukiyo-e, probably function to teach women how to look and behave in order to be favored by the male-dominant society. As Judith Butler suggests of gender performativity in her 1990 book, Gender Trouble, gender is not a stable identity and it is not a self, but act itself. Gender is a choice, or gender is a role, or gender is a construction that one puts on as one puts on clothes in the morning. I would argue that bijin-ga advocated what was proper act, performance, or role for women of the time, and that following or adopting this role might have allowed them to move upward in the socio-economical hierarchy. Ideal women of the late Edo period thus demonstrate the changing view toward lower-class sex workers, including geisha. They began to be considered morally corrupt and decadent. Importantly, this was not because of their sexual promiscuity, but rather because of their financial independence, which threatened the fundamental structure of a patriarchal system in which women were supposed to be dependent on, protected, and controlled by men. It is intriguing that financial autonomy of women was the main cause of disorder in the society in the eyes of male elite. In other words, when women depicted in picture do not demonstrate a proper gender role as assigned by male social authority, society is perceived as corrupt. The 19th century bijin-ga by Eisen can be regarded in this way. At the same time, lower class sex workers were mainly workers, many geisha, were idealized in ukiyo-e, as well as in popular books like Ninjobon. Those publications, including bijin-ga, function to educate on women how to behave, thus they were looking up to geisha as female exemplars. The 19th century bijin-ga by Eisen represent this contradictory image of women. They are decadent yet ideal. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for a very delightful, interesting talk. I think one of the things that Dr. Takemura Chan's presentation and research points out is the importance of historiography. I think it's really important to note that this idea of a decadent school of ukiyo-e was developed at a time that is quite different from our understanding of the Edo period. And it tells me, well, basically historical writing often tells us more about the worldview of the people doing the writing than about what they're writing about. And so that's one of the reasons why I think Eisen's work hasn't been studied as much as it might have been. Many of the most important ukiyo-e collections of Japanese prints, had their starts at this time period. And so artists like Eisen were passed over. Now that's changing, partly due to the work of people like Sawako and other important curators of and collectors and art historians. So that's a really important point to make. And I think you will also elucidate some of our new understandings about how gender functions and how that might be worked into our historical research. So thank you very much. If anybody has any questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A and we'll be able to address them. If not, I've got one or two I could pose to you to get the ball rolling. Why don't I ask you a question? First of all, I think your discussion of the relationship between bijin-ga images featuring sex workers and ninjobon is fascinating. I think it's a really important point to make, and I think it's important to note too that Eisen was involved in the creation of images to illustrate these books. It's also interesting to me that authorities reacted by arresting artists who I suppose were believed to be too successful in attracting a female readership, right? And so to sort of nip things in the bud, I suppose creating, arresting artists and punishing them was a way to kind of tell artists it's not safe to create these types of works. I wonder too, this makes me think, and I'm not really a specialist in Edo period culture at all, but it makes me think of books that were written with the other purpose, the opposite purpose really, of instructing young women on proper Neo-Confucian models of behavior. Books like Onna Daigaku, which granted date a whole century earlier, but was very important and very well-known work, and there were others too. I was wondering if Eisen, being a consummate professional artist, also explored imagery that was inspired perhaps by books like Onna Daigaku to present the type of view of women's behavior that the authorities might sort of agree was more suitable. Sawako, I'm sorry, you're muted right now. Yeah.
Okay, so let me make sure if I understand your question correctly. So they're so opposite of decadent or something like, so there's a women's learning text called Onna Daigaku, and that was kind of opposite of Confucian teaching. I mean, that's the Confucian teaching, and then Eisen is actually representing women who are kind of against the Confucian teaching. Interestingly, the Eisen also illustrated for one of the Onna Daigaku books. So I was kind of interested because he's known as a decadent bijin-ga artist, but at the same time, he was also depicting this other type of women. And when I compare them, of course, the clothes different, makeup different, hairstyle different. That's the only difference. And then the face type is very Eisen or Kunisada. They are very similar face type they have. So that's same. So I actually researched a little bit where that type of face come from. Then I found with this talk, I couldn't talk about Kabuki influence, but Kabuki was a big part of this subculture in the Edo period. And Utagawa school they were specialized in a Kabuki actor likeness picture. So their Kabuki onnagata actor were depicted by Utagawa artists. And because it's a likeness picture, so it has a distinctive facial feature in the depiction of those Kabuki actors. Then it's very interesting because in the publishing industry, those Utagawa school and Eisen collaborate sometimes. Then their style became very similar. So then Eisen actually, from certain point, he actually depict very Utagawa school like a face type. So face type is actually don't show any different like this is more like a Confucian traditional way of women, or this is more decadent because they have a same type of face. But what difference is that Eisen actually depict more emotion with the facial expression. That's the difference. And then when Eisen depicts the Onna Daigaku's illustration, those women don't have any emotion at all. So that's what I found. I hope this answers your question. I'm not sure.
Yes, thank you very much. Wonderful. As we wait for any other questions, here are some showing up here. Here's a question here. Thank you for your fascinating presentation. My question is, do we know very much about any of the women Eisen depicted in his prints? I assume that since many of them were lower class sex workers, they were not as well known as some of the highest class Yoshiwara Oiran, for example, Takao and others, depicted by Utamaro and others.
So Eisen was actually hired by brothel owners and depict many Yoshiwara Oiran. So there is a series of Yoshiwara Oiran highlight Korisan print. And there is a famous Korisan. I can't recall the name of the Korisan, but he actually did. Yeah. But compared to Utamaro, those 19th century artists depict a lot more lower class sex workers.
And were their names simply not known or not recorded, or I think the question focused specifically on certain named courtesans whose names were either named or given, or could be hinted at or guessed at through different content in the print.
Oh, so the actual name of courtesan?
Yeah, I guess the question is basically, what is really known about these lower class sex workers, both then and now? I mean, were they celebrated simply just for for hints of eroticism, or were there certain low class sex workers that were sort of given a boost, maybe an advertising boost or something, by these images?
Oh, okay.
This is from Lawrence Marceau, by the way. Thank you, Lawrence, for the excellent question. If I'm not interpreting your question properly, please rephrase it.
Okay. Okay. So I'm not sure if I understand your question. That's a Marceau sensei's question probably. So the purpose of lower sex workers print is to promote that business than before. So all these publishers before was just to depict highland courtesan at Yoshiwara. That was the main focus. But in the 19th century, because of those all local unlicensed quarter, and the business was booming there. So a lot more business-minded, newly established publisher want to advertise those lower class sex workers, because that way they can, publisher can gain more profit. Then also those unlicensed brothel quarter owner also gain the profit, and then artists can make a profit. So this is all this web of like business-minded people making this lower class sex worker to be the ideal women of that time.
Great, wonderful. There is another question here. Thank you for your fascinating talk. Thank you indeed. I wonder, was there also a lot of hostility or jealousy among normal women toward geisha as well, assuming a lot of married commoner men were visiting these sex workers? Or was the idea that men go to sex workers pretty much normalized?
A lot of jealousy. Okay. I didn't find any historical document actually about jealousy toward geisha. But of course it should be, but I didn't find anything. But if you think about the Edo period patriarchal system, it was actually allowed men to have many the women, I mean the wives or mistress. So actually the Ninjobon, the Shunshoku Ume Goyomi from calendar, at the end, the Tanjiro, the main character, male main character, married to the first wife and also have mistress, then that's the happy end. So for the women's,
happy for him at least, right?
Yeah. So women's point of view, is that okay, you know? And also we have a modern viewpoint, but that's what the writer, male writer, write it, and then kind of like teaching women, this is okay, this works. So in a way that also Ninjobon and Eisen's bijin-ga teach how to perceive certain kind of rules in the patriarchal society.
Great, okay, thank you. No other questions so far. I do have another, if I could. Mark, go ahead.
I can go with you're gonna have to mute there. I can go with a question, which is, where can we find these prints outside of Japan? Are there outstanding collections? And in particular, might we be able to see them here in Honolulu?
Yeah, I know the Honolulu Museum of Art has some good 19th century print, but their main, the majority of them, their collection is kind of 18th century classical beauty print. So that, which is great too. They have a great Eisen's shunga at the Honolulu Museum of Art. So those are all important. Outside of Japan, where I studied for my PhD research, was at the Netherlands, Leiden University. And they have, it's not the Leiden University, but there is it's a national university, and there's all affiliated museum around. One of them is the Ethnology Museum at the Leiden. They have huge collection of those 19th century Utagawa or Eisen prints. They are either bijin-ga or actor printer, and which is great because you know that East India Company traveled to Japan, and then they collected so many, not just the ukiyo-e print, but also like toothbrush, the bowl, or all kind of things we use for everyday life. And then it's interesting because ukiyo-e is considered art in our, contemporary mind, but the actually ethnology museum has. So they collect it as a kind of specimen. It's not artwork. So, but now we are looking at them as an art and also as a historical visual document of the Edo period. So I really recommend if you are studying 19th century ukiyo-e, the Leiden is a great place to go. And of course, the Boston Museum, Fine Art of Boston Museum, and Chicago, New York Public Library, and Met, they all have a great collection.
There's another question in the Q&A. Thank you for this talk. It has been very interesting. Do we know how much of the encouragement of this new form of independence for women on the parts of artists was for business versus being purely out of wanting to encourage women's independence? In other words, how much of this was inspired by profit and how much of it was actually an interest in changing the way people think about women and their independence?
Okay, so it's very interesting question. From my research, this was purely for profit, but we all perceive art in a different way. So we don't know if the women that time look at the print and how they perceive, we don't know. They might feel kind of, oh, great, this is a new opportunity. We have financial power. We can purchase, all these prints or popular books or new style of kimono, makeup. It's encouraged them to enjoy the new possibility in life. So that's how affect their thinking, but it's not from the beginning, they intentionally try to change the women's independence or financial power.
Kind of going off that, if I can jump in, since so many of these works, actually all of them, were done by male artists, that is, like, all of it was a male gaze upon all of these women, in what ways do you think those depictions kind of shaped the ways that these women were perceived by society, since they became, kind of seen as a threat to the patriarchy, things like that you were talking about? How do you think these women being depicted by men contributed to that?
So let me repeat your question. So how the male gaze or male, male's ideal woman affected the production of Keisai Eisen's print.
More
Like
that because he was a man making this work of women. So like these depictions of women were by a man. How do you think the artist being male depicting these women through a male gaze kind of shaped the ways in which those women were perceived by society in general and by like the patriarchy that kind of started to see them as a threat?
Yes. So in a Ninja Bon, I said that Eisen was one of the members of Shunsui's literary circle. And this literary circle is like, I don't know, 10 to 15 people, or writers or kabuki writer. So it's tended to be very male-centered, thinking, and then it's probably very much affected those Eisen's bijin-ga or the popular books. But interestingly, that Shunsui's circle has one retired geisha who is a teacher of shamisen. And then it's hard to find her input, but it is known that there's one female in that circle. And then, she might give some kind of suggestion to those, the images or stories. But also women want to make more money too. That was, business-minded circle. So I don't know if in this point, how much important to be women or men to create this type of commercial commodity. So that to me, the focus is to make a profit from this. So women contribute and then men contribute to make this great image to sell to the audience. So it's all like creators, audience, they all have. So it's called social discourse makes art, this kind of art. So it reflects their thinking in a way.
Well, that brings us to 1 o'clock. Sawako, you ended right on the bell. Amazing. I want to thank you for a very stimulating talk. And also, Mark, would you like to say any final words before we finish?
Well, we are going to try to get this up online, the recording, and we will send that out to the people who've registered. And also, please follow us on social media. We are on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, if I'm getting all that correct. But most importantly, I want to thank Dr. Chang for today's talk. This was really outstanding, and we're so fortunate to have been able to learn from her today, and hope the conversation will continue. Mahalo.
Thank you.